Today, we are talking about Afghanistan. The U.S. military has withdrawn and was defeated. After 20 years, the United States, the world's largest empire, was defeated in Afghanistan. We're joined today by one of the leading experts on Eurasian politics and who has spent a lot of time in Afghanistan. I'm talking about Pepe Escobar. He is a really unique geopolitical analyst and journalist. I always love reading his perspective. I don't know anyone else who has such a unique perspective, and is also a great writer. It's always fun to read his literary style, and his latest article begins with a quote from lyrics from The Doors. So he's always a fun read. But Pepe is also a great guest to talk about Afghanistan, because Pepe has actually spent a lot of time in Afghanistan and actually was arrested by the Taliban. There aren't a lot of journalists who can say that they were arrested twice, not once, but twice. So I want to begin this discussion, Pepe, talking about an article that you just published, which is at Asia Times. That's Pepe is a columnist. He writes for several different outlets, but he just published a really good article at the Asia Times, which is a good overview of the U.S. defeat in Afghanistan. And it's called "The Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan Back with a Bang." It's a good piece. It explains how the Taliban took over the capital, Kabul, and they did it in a few days after 20 years of U.S. military occupation. But what's interesting is that, as he writes here, this is his analysis, and this is what we want to talk about today with Pepe. We're also going to talk about his reporting on the role of the CIA and the opium rat line in Afghanistan. We're going to talk about the role of pipelines in geopolitics and minerals. But I think this is a key takeaway from his article, and this is what I'm going to let you start with here, Pepe. This is what you write in your article. "Now, the loss of Afghanistan should be interpreted as a repositioning. It fits the new geopolitical configuration where the Pentagon's top mission is not the war on terror anymore, but to simultaneously try to isolate Russia and harass China by all means on the expansion of the new Silk Roads." I'll leave it to you, Pepe, to comment on that argument.
Okay, how many hours we got? The whole day? It's look, guys, it's very difficult to be concise when we are dealing with such a. This is what game changing is all about. You know, this is. I've been talking this with some of my good analyst connections in the West, but also Russians as well. And many of us tend to think this as even more important than 9/11. Not only because it's the Ouroboros effect, you know, the snake biting its own tail, everything that happened in the century, in fact. Until now, of course, for all of us, the most important geopolitical happening of the 21st century, the start of the 21st century was 9/11. If Eric Hobsbawm was with us, he would probably agree, you know. And now the circle has closed and we are into a new paradigm again. And that sentence that you quoted at the beginning, it's just a glimpse of what's ahead. Because by now, all of you in the US know that the number 1 and 2 strategic threats to the United States, or at least for the people who assume they are conducting policy for the United States, are Russia and China, which happens to be a strategic partnership. So you can imagine Brzezinski rolling in his grave at 24/7 because he was always desperate about the emergence of a peer competitor in Eurasia, especially in the Eurasian heartland. This is Geopolitics 101, in fact. And that's what moved Brzezinski at the time, even before the Soviets entered Afghanistan, to invent a jihad, which is something that we are living the after effects of this invention 40 years later. And now the whole thing turned upside down because it's not a jihadist movement that emerged in Afghanistan again. Now the second reincarnation of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which was announced, in fact, officially, including with a flag. We still don't know if this flag is the definitive flag of the new Islamic Emirate, which is a coat of arms mixed with the Taliban flag. So, and now we have what? We have Vietnam too, which is something that's being widely discussed in the US, of course, but with a twist. Not only is the second time that a peasant guerrilla army destroys, literally destroys, and says goodbye to the hyperpower, but after being completely subdued, at least from the point of view of the Beltway, for nearly 20 years. And after the first rationale for the bombing and invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, and I followed all this process over there between Pakistan, the tribal areas, and then Afghanistan. And even before 9/11, I was in Afghanistan, even before 9/11. So I spent basically the second part of 2001 between Pakistan, the tribal areas, and Afghanistan until mid-December 2001. And now we have the return of the Islamic Emirate, but who is, and now there are varying degrees of support, encouragement, advice, stage management, like we saw in the first Taliban press conference this week in Kabul. We have Russia and China acting together, diplomatically together, in terms of the strategic partnership and within the larger context of an organization that very few people in the US know about in detail, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is, if you talk to people in the Beltway, they're going to say, this is the Asian NATO. It's not important. It's a talk shop, etc. They don't know who they are dealing with. And the SCO, which, by the way, it's very interesting. The SCO was founded 3 months before 9/11. The SCO was founded in July 2001. Can you believe this? At the time, it was called Shanghai 5, because it was China, Russia, and 3 of the Central Asian stands. And then over the years became the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Basically, in the beginning, it was an organization which was supposed to fight what the Chinese, with their fabulous numerology all the time, call the 3 evils: terrorism, separatism, extremism. And then over the years, they evolved. And now it's a political, economic, diplomatic, and security mechanism, not only with these 5 initial members, but also with India and Pakistan, and something very important that's going to happen next month in their summit in Dushanbe in Tajikistan, which is directly related to what's going on in Afghanistan as well. Iran is going to become a full member of the SCO. So what do we have? We have all the major players in East Asia, the intersection of Central Asia and South Asia, where Afghanistan is. Afghanistan is a member of, is an observer of the SCO. And the full members are going to have Russia, China, India, Pakistan, and Iran sitting at the same table and discussing everything important in terms of political, economic, and security integration in Eurasia. They're bringing Afghanistan into the fold, which means that sooner or later, Afghanistan is going to become a full member as well. So what does this tell us? Tell us, once again, the big story of the 21st century, which, irrespective of what the US was doing, which was basically war on terror for most of these past 20 years, the big story is the integration of Eurasia with Russia and China as, let's say, the primus inter pares, to remember our Latin. You know, they are, of course, everybody's more or less equal, but of course, Russia and China are more equal than the others. And everybody under the same roof, which is something that we're going to see next month, discussing, among other extremely important geopolitical issues, how are we going to integrate Afghanistan into an all-Asian project of economic and political integration? How are we going to support their efforts to have a country that is relatively stable? And now that the strategic partnership was given on their lap, this absolutely gift from Allah, maybe, of Afghanistan falling on their laps, practically. It's no wonder that behind the scenes, they are more or less, I described it as stage managing, but it's more like it's stage managing in the sense of pointing to the Afghan Taliban where to position themselves in the global stage. So the other half, which is what we could call NATO stan, the United States and the Europeans in NATO, more or less have to respect this new paradigm and at least try to live with it, which is something that obviously we're not seeing and we're not going to see in a long time. Okay, let's say this is more or less the introduction. So I'm open to your questions, guys. I think it's going to be much more lively.
Well, as an introduction, that was very really sweeping analysis about what to expect geopolitically. And there's so many issues that we haven't even gotten to, just about the immediate rapid defeat and collapse of the so-called U.S. partner force. I know Ben wants to talk about Afghanistan, but I'm talking about Afghanistan because I just can't pronounce it like that. I just want to apologize.
Afghanistan. American English always has so many nasally A's. Afghanistan.
Yeah. Well, at least I managed to, not say Iraq and
Iran.
Where did you run? I ran so far away.
I remember Michelle Obama would always try to say Iran properly, but she'd say Iran. So it sounds like the fermented milk that you get at Middle Eastern restaurants. But anyway, there's I wanted to just get your reaction because you wrote a piece on August 13th about the Saigon moment of the U.S. And I want to get your comment on looking back before we look forward to the geopolitical situation and talk about your piece that came out today about implications for Russia and China and how the Taliban have embarked on a fairly sophisticated PR campaign to cultivate support from the so-called international community. They want to be the Taliban 2.0.
Exactly.
Yeah, but there's a clip I want to play, a video, and it's from a Hollywood film in the 80s. And I want to get your reaction to it. And I guess like after we play it, I'll follow up with like a quick question. But this is a monologue from Colonel Sam Troutman, who was the sidekick of John Rambo, his former commander. And, Troutman would just appear briefly in Rambo 1 and 2 to kind of advocate for Rambo. Like he's out there and you're not supporting him and he's gone crazy, but I can talk to him. But then in Rambo 3, Colonel Troutman actually joins John Rambo on the battlefield, and they are assisting in a kind of train and equip program for the Afghan Mujahideen back. And Troutman's like the CIA, one of the CIA assets. Who's a hero in this film, and they're the freedom fighters, and the Soviet commanders are seen as these boneheaded fools who don't understand that you can get bogged down. Well, let's just play the clip. This is an exchange between him and a Soviet commander.
All right, here we go. This is on.
There won't be a victory.
Every day
you can all hear that, right?
Machines lose ground to a bunch of poorly armed, poorly equipped freedom fighters. The fact is that you underestimated your competition. If you'd studied your history, you'd know that these people have never given up to anyone. They'd rather die than be slaves to an invading army. You can't defeat a people like that. We tried. We already had our Vietnam. Now you're going to have there won't be a victory.
That's the clip.
So, talk about being prescient, huh? Wow.
Yeah. Well, the sheer irony, like why didn't the Pentagon watch Rambo 3? I mean, what?
They practically
Yes, but,
produced it. I mean, you
it
might as well
produced
watch it.
No, but the industrial military complex, they also watch it. They say, who cares? We're profiting from it anyway.
Great point. Great point.
That's
That's the point to make.
So
That's exactly what happened.
Is that what you think explains the hubris of the Pentagon, which was really driving the agenda? Why the military intelligence lied? Why the commanders lied about the situation on the ground to political leadership? It is that they're advancing their own bureaucratic interests.
To a great extent, Max, it does. In terms of the internal dynamics of the industrial military complex and how do they operate globally. Look, you know what's the GDP of Afghanistan, the latest number that we have, I think, is 2019. It was around $20 billion a year. Not much, 19 point something. So if we calculate that the Pentagon spent $2 billion, which is more in those 20 years in Afghanistan, that makes $100 billion a year. That's 5 times the Afghan GDP spent by essentially the industrial military complex on Afghanistan and in Afghanistan and certain pockets of Afghanistan a year. What do they have to show for it? We are all seeing it, literally nothing, except when you look at the appreciation of industrial military complex stocks. And then we see 1,000% appreciation, 600% appreciation, 900% appreciation. So if you invested in Northrop Grumman, Boeing stocks, etc., for the past 20 years, you made a killing. And all of them did, in fact. And they managed to keep selling most of the material that was appropriated for free by the Taliban this past, according to the Taliban themselves, 11 days that it took them to conquer, I would say 98% of the country, except the Panjshir Valley, which is basically a natural fortress. Nobody get in and you cannot get out. Voila,
Yeah, and Pepe, can we talk more about the geopolitical situation? We saw actually a really interesting historic meeting that happened this February where Taliban leadership, this is, of course, well, you still have this puppet regime led by Ghani, who, by the way, is alleged to have just fled the country with nearly $200 million in cash. And I don't know what you've heard. Apparently he's in the UAE or there's been...
This is correct, Ben. It was $169 million, apparently the final figure that we have, not counting the $5 million that were abandoned at Kabul airport. We have 2 very serious sources corroborating this scenario. One of them is one of Ghani's own bodyguards in Kabul, and the other one is the Afghan ambassador in Dushanbe in Tajikistan. So this is very, very serious. And this guy actually, look, we need an international arrest warrant against Ghani. And nobody knew where he was. What we knew until yesterday, when it was confirmed that he is in the UAE, we don't know if he's in Abu Dhabi or Dubai. Whatever. He is now a protege of Mohammed bin Zayed, who is the protector of Mohammed bin Salman. So this is absolutely fascinating, isn't it? Like if Ghani is another member of the Trump entourage now. Anyway, his plane was refused to enter Tajik territory. So he had to go to Uzbekistan. Apparently, he was refused in Uzbekistan as well. So the last itinerary that we have is that he first landed in Oman. And then from Oman, there was some sort of negotiation, and he finally ended up in the Emirates. So this guy is a fugitive from justice, essentially, and a common thief. So this gives you another extra dimension of the kind of people that the U.S. puts in positions of power all over the world. But this is something that across the global south, everybody knows this story or similar stories, right?
Absolutely. And I mean, there's so much to say about Ashraf Ghani. This guy was basically made in a laboratory in DC.
Yes.
He's got his start studying in the United States and U.S. elite universities, including Columbia, studying anthropology, which is like the spook discipline. There's some good articles showing like CIA infiltration of anthropology, and like look at Obama's mom, who is an anthropologist in scare quotes. Like it's the perfect CIA cover, right? I mean, aside from journalists, it's the perfect CIA cover because they can send all these anthropologists to these countries targeted for regime change and destabilization, and then they say, "Oh, I'm just doing academic research." So, anyway, Ashraf Ghani, it's noteworthy that he comes out of that realm.
Like they did it in Indonesia before the massacre in '65. Same thing. They did it in Brazil.
Mom was there.
Yeah. Obama's mom was there.
Obama's mom was there. Exactly.
Just a coincidence, though.
Yes.
Just a coincidence.
Go ahead.
But so, I mean, there's so much to say about Ghani, this guy. I mean, maybe we can talk a bit more about him because it's noteworthy that after studying in elite universities, he later worked at the World Bank. I mean, his resume is just, it's such a cliche textbook example of these figures in the global South who are cultivated by the U.S. empire to become their assets. And they go through elite universities and they work at the World Bank where they're trained in neoliberal political economy. And then he comes into Afghanistan as this kind of neo-colonial puppet administrator installed by the U.S. and becomes president. And then he writes a book called Fixing Failed States. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. And he also wrote a report for all of these DC think tanks. He wrote this report advising Syria on its transition, advising the Syrian government of President Bashar al-Assad on how it should transition. This guy whose government didn't last 3 days, literally didn't last 3 days without the U.S. military protecting it, but he wants to advise Syria on how to transition. I mean, it's absolutely farcical.
And the inside story, Max and Ben, of his departure is something absolutely extraordinary, in fact. Hamid Karzai was already involved in, when he saw which way the wind was blowing, which was basically the Taliban would arrive in Kabul by the weekend. So we're talking about between Friday and Saturday. He approached Ghani and said, look, there's no other way. We need to organize a mechanism for transition of power or an interim government, at least. And Ghani refused it. You know, there was not even the possibility of which is something that is totally anti-Afghan. If you've been to Afghanistan and if you understand a little bit of how the Pashtuns work or even the Tajiks work, everything is negotiable. It's like they have mini shuras every day to decide about everything you can imagine, which is exactly what Hamid Karzai and Abdullah are doing now. These are the two people who are conducting what's going to be the negotiations towards what's going to be the next Afghan government. It's going to be led by Mullah Baradar, of course. He's probably going to be the president. But there's going to be probably an inclusive cabinet, including probably women and maybe even including Shiites. And Hamid Karzai and Abdullah, I've met them in the past. You know, for all their flaws, they are very, very experienced and they're very able negotiators, both of them. Abdullah is a very sweet guy, wonderful to talk to. He listens to people, which is the absolute opposite of Ghani. Ghani was like this, imperial figure, father knows best. And he was despised even inside his administration. He couldn't get along with practically anybody. He was completely isolated already, even weeks before the fall of Kabul. So he refused any possible negotiation, which was a way for him to maybe have a decent exit. Because the number one red line imposed by the Taliban months ago, even in the discussions in Doha of the extended troika, Russia, China, the US, and Pakistan. There was a red line for the Taliban. He has to go. We agree. Anybody else, we agree. It can be Abdullah, it can be Hamid Karzai, it can be another Tajik, as long as we are the head of the government, but he has to go. So, in fact, he disappeared from the palace without telling anybody. So it was him, his chief of staff, and another advisor who fled to the airport, with the $160 million, apparently in 4 cars. We don't know if they were in 3 cars or 4 cars, but basically with the $169 million, stuffed everything in a helicopter, put the rest on the plane, and left. So Hamid Karzai and Abdullah, they were in the palace in the on Sunday morning. Said, what do we do next? There's no president, there's no government, and there's no new government. And even the Taliban were, wow, so are we the government now, or who's the government? So that absolutely spectacular, I would say the most powerful image, I would put it even above the Twin Towers in terms of historical resonance. The famous First Supper without the supper. It was like a Leonardo or a Caravaggio painting of the Taliban on the table in the presidential palace, mirroring a picture behind the wall, which is basically a picture of a cleric blessing a warrior surrounded by the other warriors. But this is so incredibly powerful for Islam. I can imagine that everyone in Islam that saw that picture, they had a jolt, an electric jolt. It's extremely powerful, the symbolism. And when you look at the faces of the Taliban on the table, exactly. One of them is praying. 2 or 3 are almost crying. They have an expression of, they are beyond tired, but at the same time, they know that this is the Holy Grail. They're not gloating, and it's an expression of humility. In fact, it's almost like they were about to, I think, the way I see it, they were about to conduct a short prayer, probably. So this is so incredibly powerful. And when you add to it the political component of they didn't even know if they were the new government or what, in fact. And then on another room in the palace, you had Abdullah and Hamid Karzai. Okay, what do we do next? So, in fact, this is when they had, I would say, the brilliant idea, okay, let's constitute a sort of interim committee. Us, of course, they're already there. Let's call somebody else. And obviously, a very risky undertaking. They called Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, former warlord, turned bomber of Kabul, turned America's wanted, probably number 1 or number 2 for a while. I remember in 2002, I was in Kunar in Eastern Afghanistan.
Big time CIA asset before you.
Big time, very good, Max. Big time CIA asset and Saudi Arabian asset as well. And then turned politician. He was the leader of the Hezbollah Islamic Party. He became a respectable politician, etc. So, but the problem is, Hekmatyar, okay, the guy is a has-been. No, he still commands a lot of respect in many tribal intersections in Afghanistan. So it's important to have a guy like this on your table. Otherwise, he's going to turn against you. That's a classic Afghan politics, right? So, okay, so now we have this committee of these 3 wise guys, let's put it this way. And these are the people, especially Hamid Karzai and Abdullah, who are more or less shaping the new government. Mullah Baradar came from Qatar to Kandahar. He arrived yesterday in Kandahar. He's probably going to go to Kabul till the end of the week. The conversations are in Kabul. Today, for instance, they were talking to the Pakistani ambassador in Afghanistan, which is a very important figure. They are having discussions with the Russian ambassador in Afghanistan, another extremely important figure. So they're trying to organize a consensus. So this is not a bunch of guerrilla fanatics from the middle of Helmand province who show up in Kabul and say, no, we are the new government. No, this is a very sophisticated negotiating process, in progress. And considering what we heard yesterday at their first press conference, we expect this to be a completely different paradigm, geopolitical situation, a political situation with what happened between 1996 and 2001. I remember at the time, it was an absolute mess. You would arrive at the Ministry of Foreign Relations house, which was practically a shack in Kandahar, and you saw that you were literally in a shack in sub-Saharan Africa, not in the Ministry of Foreign Relations of a major Eurasian nation. The pressers after 9/11 and before the American bombing, they were in the garden of the Afghan embassy in Islamabad. It was an absolute chaos. No translation, a mess. We didn't even know what they were talking about, in fact. And now it's a completely different story. They have very good English-speaking spokesmen, several, not only one, not only Shaheen, who's in Doha, part of the political committee in Doha, several. The press conference was an extremely well-organized endeavor. So it's a completely different story. And the most important thing, they are getting what we could call again the stage management clues from the Russians, especially collaborating with the Chinese, of course, look, this is how you need to present yourselves to the world. These are the red lines. You have to be inclusive. You have to conquer world public opinion. So it's a very sophisticated soft power operation. We don't know how this is going to, afterwards, but it has started in a very impressive way.
Well, let's talk about that. Ben,
go ahead, Max.
Ben showed a picture of that glass table they were around. I assume there was no skag on the table, but we want to talk about that later. There's a lot of discussion about heroin in the chat, and we're going to get to that. But I just wanted to specifically ask you, because you were building up to it and you wrote about it in your column today, about that press conference. It was remarkable. And, I watched it on Al Jazeera English, which was actually the only place.
You probably got a good translation, Max.
No, yeah, exactly. No, I got a bunch of British assholes saying, this is remarkable, stunning stuff, remarkable, amazing stuff, unbelievable. And there was no translation. And then you have the Al Jazeera Arabic guy there who's like, they always got the exclusives with bin Laden, and, they were always there. But we got nothing out of that press conference. So afterwards, I was able to digest it. And you wrote about what Zabihullah Mujahid, the spokesman, promised, which was not what I think at least the Western media was expecting, because they were familiar with, as you said, the 96 through 2001 Taliban 1.0. Hijab only, as in Qatar and Iran. No burqa.
No burqas. Yes.
The so-called interpreters, who also happen to include probably thousands of collaborators, including people who may have participated in the crimes of the U.S. occupation, will be given a general amnesty. There were some very friendly notes sounded towards Afghanistan's Shia population, which very few expected, the protection of Shia shrines.
Right.
Really quickly, sorry to cut you off, Max, but we saw, I mean, they were, media events, but we saw some Taliban officials actually went to a Shia mosque and participated in their religious ceremony, which was a diplomatic and marketing sign to the Shia community.
Oh, yes. And Ben and Max, practically unheard of. We still remember how they treated the Hazara Shias from 1996 to 2001. I talked to a lot of Hazaras in Kabul at the time, and they were terrified. They were behind closed doors all the time. They wouldn't even venture to go out. They were isolated in a few ghettos in Kabul, and they told absolutely horror stories about it. And after and during that interval between the American bombing and the fall of Kabul, the Hazaras who were in Kabul, they were still terrified because they thought that the Taliban could return at any moment.
Yeah.
So this is a completely different situation.
So what's to account for it? I mean, I think that there's clearly a Qatari role here. You know,
Yes.
in the hotels of Qatar, you would just bump into Taliban leadership at any moment. They were coached there, and we saw under Qatari, I wouldn't say management, but coaching, Hamas revised its charter to remove anti-Semitic passages. It was an obvious appeal to the outside world for normalized relations. So is this the hand of Doha, or what's to account for this
It's
kinder, gentler Taliban?
It's the hand of Doha, Max, you know, because they are, the Taliban have been established, let's put it this way, in Doha for years now. I remember visiting their palace in Doha, 2000, yes, I think it was like 8 years ago. They already had a representation in Doha in a very, very nice palace near the Museum of Islamic Art. So they have been there for a long time and obviously taking lessons. It didn't start with the Doha process last year after the Trump agreement in February 2020. No, this thing started years ago. And not only Doha, their relations with these three key players: Russia, Iran, and China. The Iranians, of course, this is more or less off the record. They say that the really serious contacts with the Taliban started right after the Arab Spring. So that makes it practically 10 years. The Russians, this is something that very few people knew in Washington. The Russian, no, it was Kabulov, in fact. Kabulov said earlier this week that they had their serious conversations with the Taliban started 7 years ago. Nobody talked about this, last year or even a few weeks ago, that the Russians were talking with the Taliban at the highest level for 7 years. And the Chinese, of course, obviously. And they would never tell you when they started, but this was years ago as well. And Iran. We already talked about Iran. Sorry. So Qatar, Iran, Russia, China, not to mention Pakistan for obvious reasons, because most of the old school Taliban leaders, they actually lived or still live in Quetta, Balochistan, Pakistani territory. So, they were talking to everybody. So in terms of what they learned,
Karzai is from Quetta as well, and he was always considered kind of a channel. They called him kind of like the Gucci Mujahideen, and he was always kind of soft on the Taliban.
Oh man, you should have seen his brother Max when he was alive. He was the number one drug dealer. He was the number one drug dealer in Pakistan at the time. I interviewed this guy. Can you believe this shit? I managed to interview this guy do you remember in 2001 when everybody was looking for Hamid Karzai until he was parachuted somewhere by the Americans? Well, at the time, I said, okay, let's try to talk to his brother, but we couldn't find his brother. So, and guess what? Some guys in the Quetta underground gave us, we have, you want the phone number of Hamad Karzai? We have it. And they gave it to us.
Well, Max, unless there was something you wanted to add, I was going to try to pivot a little bit and talk more.
His brother, the drug dealer, was also a CIA asset. He was on the CIA.
Also a CIA asset. So correct.
If we got to get into that. Yeah.
Max, just like the vice president, don't forget that Saleh, the guy who's starting the resistance in the Panjshir Valley now, also a CIA asset. He says he's the acting president now. Can you believe this? He was with the Massoud Jr. yesterday, and they are organizing the resistance in the Panjshir Valley, which is basically a bunch of Honda 50cc in a few flags.
That's is Ahmed Shah Massoud's son.
Unfortunately, I hate to Well, I met the father, and the father, everybody know, we all know, he was an icon. He was a legend, and he was a great man. I was extremely impressed by him. And the son, well, I would put it in the Donald J. Trump Jr. category, you know. And this guy is going to be sold by the CIA as the leader of the resistance.
Well, the son has an op-ed in the Washington Post right now.
Exactly.
Presenting himself as just that. Maybe we can throw it up on screen. But
yes,
just to give our viewers some context, Ahmed Shah Massoud was the main recipient of CIA money during the Operation Cyclone, right above Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. And he was kind of considered, he was beloved by the CIA. He was considered the moderate rebel. He was also an excellent commander, as you pointed out.
Yes.
And yeah, his son seems to be kind of a clown. He was killed, 2 days before 9/11 by a crew of Al-Qaeda, an Al-Qaeda hit team posing as a French camera crew, and they shot him through essentially a camera gun. And that was a signal many took of the forthcoming 9/11 attack.
Absolutely correct, Max. And this story is, well, for me, it's very painful because I had interviewed Massoud in the Panjshir practically exactly 20 years ago. It was in mid-August 2001. Then I left to Faizabad, which was an absolutely demented trip, caught a UN flight back to Peshawar. And when I arrived in Peshawar, my local connections, they were telling me, look, we have a bombshell for you. The Americans want to send a commando to extract Osama bin Laden from Kandahar. And Musharraf said, no, because if I authorize this, I have a civil war here the same minute. And this is what I published on August 30th, 2001. And then on the 9th, I got a very cryptic message from our friends in the Panjshir. I think it was two or three words. They were saying the commander has been shot, and that was it. And I tried to, obviously, you tried to place even a satellite phone call to the Panjshir. Absolutely impossible. So we only knew the next day about what Max just said. It was two Al-Qaeda operatives disguised as a camera crew. Massoud was killed in the explosion of the fake camera. One of the Al-Qaeda guys was killed by one of his bodyguards, and the other one later on. And everybody, okay, is this, what is this? So when 9/11 happened, exactly 2 days later, everybody made the connection. And then 1 year later, back in the Panjshir, I could make the connection. The guy who gave the letter of presentation for Massoud's people in the Panjshir for these two Al-Qaeda, for this fake Al-Qaeda camera crew, was Sayyaf. And Sayyaf was another warlord protected by Saudi Arabia and also with American connections. So then we could finally see the plot, but only 1 year later, So when I saw Massoud Jr. this time, and I made the comparisons with what his father lived and what he was trying to do, can you imagine, Ben and Max, that Massoud, the last 3 weeks that he was alive, you know what he was doing? He was plotting a counter-offensive against the Taliban in the northern part of Afghanistan, in Talokan. He said, he showed me a map. He said, look, if we go here, blah, 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 if we capture Talokan, then we're going to have almost 10% of Afghan territory. Can you believe this is what he was doing at the time? And he explicitly said, I am fighting against, he didn't say coalition, of course, but I'm fighting against a trio, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, and the ISI. And that's a very complicated story because Massoud, before, he had very good relations with the ISI. When Max said, when he was a top American asset, he worked side by side with the ISI. Although the ISI favorite was Hekmatyar, was not Massoud. In fact, all of the so-called Peshawar warlords, the guy who were taking the big money and then distributing the money with the jihadis, they worked very close with the ISI and with the CIA. That's the whole story.
Right. It's like Peshawar was so filled with CIA and ISI spooks, it was hard to distinguish. And like when Abdullah Azzam was killed, no one even knew who was responsible, because it could have been Al-Qaeda, it could have been ISI, it could have been CIA. It was all mixed up. But, you know, just a quick point here, and I know Ben has a question, but just quickly, because we're talking about 9/11, and that it looms in the background. The smoldering towers loom in the background of the scenes of the so-called interpreters trying to get inside a C-130 airlift. That causes it animates the panic in Washington over the Taliban returning to power. I do not believe the Taliban had a role in 9/11, but most Americans
definitely not.
They're responsible.
Most Americans do.
Yes. Mullah Omar was deeply uncomfortable with bin Laden's presence, and they want to erase this history. So I don't know if you have a comment on that.
It's good that you bring it up, Max, because probably I would say most of American public opinion does not remember that Mullah Omar and the Taliban leadership at the time made a formal offer to the Bush administration to, okay, we hand you bin Laden if you give us evidence that he was directly involved on 9/11. They made that offer.
This is so crucial, this point. And they also said that they would extradite him to another Muslim country where he could be held at trial. They said that he could be held at trial, but of course the U.S. didn't want that. They didn't want a trial for bin Laden.
Of course not, because they are already thinking about the bombing and the invasion. And of course, Rumsfeld was already thinking about Iraq. So, you know, that was the
7 countries in 5 years.
7 countries. Exactly. So
that was their goal. 7 countries have regime change in 5 years, beginning with Afghanistan.
But this is, guys, this is a very important point, because I would say that sooner or later, right at the beginning of this new government, the Taliban will do their best to prove the disconnect between what they were doing in 2001 and 9/11. There is absolutely zero connection. Zero connection. There are no Afghans involved. Any way you look at how the whole thing developed, right, wrong, fiction or not, I'm not debating that. What I'm stating with absolute certainty, and this came from them and then confirmed by Pakistani intelligence, which may or may not have had a hand in some details of 9/11. That's another enormous discussion. Afghanistan and the Taliban had absolutely, apart from the fact that, faithful to the Pashtunwali code, they were offering hospitality to Osama, and already in 2001, he was becoming a very, very problematic guest. But according to the Pashtunwali code, you cannot simply throw out your guest at your will. No way. That's why they needed a very good reason to say to Osama goodbye. And that's why they asked the Bush administration for evidence, which was never provided. So this is very important. And I'm sure this was discussed with everybody, with the Iranians, with the Russians, with the Chinese, with the Qataris, obviously. And sooner rather than later, this has to be erased, because then the label of terrorist organization over the Taliban instantly disappears. And this is something that the Russians have advised the Taliban. Look, if you manage to do this in a sense that global public opinion can see clearly that you had nothing to do with 9/11, that's it. That's it. And this is going to happen.
Well, Max, was there something you wanted to jump on? Because I want to pivot a bit to talk more about other elements of geopolitics, especially the Tapi pipeline. But did you have anything you wanted to add?
Well, the title of this live stream, a part of it was the opium rat line, and I've seen a lot of comments about that.
Yeah, well,
So
that's part of it.
I could talk about this history forever, and I love it, but I really, let's get into that. Let's do a pivot.
Yeah, an Asia pivot, if you will. So
Right, Asia pivot, allow Obama administration.
Exactly. And we're going to take a pause there and continue this discussion with the journalist Pepe Escobar in part 2. In the second part, we're going to talk about pipeline conflicts, the pipeline wars going on in Central Asia and South Asia. Afghanistan plays a key role in that, talking about the TAPI pipeline, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline, TAPI, and ideas for other pipelines. And of course, the goal of the US and the European Union is to try to kick Russia out of the energy market in the West by using these pipelines to export gas from Central Asia to the Mediterranean out to the West. So we're going to talk about pipeline politics, and then we're also going to talk about the role of opium, which is extremely important in Afghanistan, the CIA heroin rat line, which is similar to the CIA heroin rat line in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam and its neighbors during the US war in Vietnam. And finally, the role of minerals, the $1 trillion in estimated untapped minerals in Afghanistan. So definitely join us in part 2. It's a great discussion we continued with the geopolitical analyst and journalist, Pepe Escobar. If you want to support this show, you can go to patreon.com/moderaterebels. All of your support means a lot, and thanks a lot for listening. See you next time.